Now we know how to develop a single page iOS app. And it's good, it can get the job done. But sometimes we have to do a lot more in our iOS apps. And a single page app is not good enough. Now, before we start talking and taking a deep dive into navigation on the iOS platform, let's first understand the difference between single page apps and multi page apps. And why do we need multiple pages in the app? And if we add multiple pages app, then how do we provide some sort of navigation to move from screen A to screen B, and then to screen C, and then eventually to screen A or a totally new screen? Um, let's start with some of the native iOS apps which are out there. This is a good starting point for us to look at. And we're going to look at the calculator application. If you open up the calculator application, you will see that there is a lot of buttons that are provided by which we can do the arithmetic operations of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. But there isn't really a way to move out of this screen. There are like 10 different screens that I have to go to. And this is an example of single page app. So was our mortgage calculator that we developed in our last lesson. Everything is contained on the same page. Now, don't get me wrong, it does not mean that new content cannot be presented on these screens. The content can be presented on the same page itself by alerts or by collapsible widgets which are present. But still, there is no real navigation involved because all those are just button clicks resulting in some action being performed and not really navigating to a totally new screen. Now, as compared to a single page calculator app, if we go back and look at the settings app which is provided by iOS, we'll see that, well, that's not a single page app. There's a lot more happening here. I land upon the settings screen, which has a lot of options. And the options include is general, notifications, privacy, serious search, and I can just click on any of the options. For example, click on journal, and then I can go forward and drill down into more options. And suddenly you can see that at the top section, there is a title, which says journal, and there's a back arrow which comes with a label setting saying that if I click on settings, I will go back to my previous screen that I was viewing. And I can actually go deeper down inside my selections, like I can go to airdrop, and then I can see that, okay, well, I'm landing upon new screen, but now the previous option is changed to journal from settings, and I can go back to the journal screens and then to the settings screens. So it's maintaining context of my navigation stack, and it's knowing how when I move from screen A, which is settings, to screen B, which is journal, to screen C, which was airdrop, and so that when I hit the back buttons, I can do that particular navigation pattern in the reverse order. Now, if we look at the iOS app architecture, Apple actually recommends that we can follow any of these three navigation mechanisms. One is hierarchical navigation, which you just saw, followed by the settings app itself, where you just can start from the parent page, drill down into totally different pages, and then you can navigate back. So this is the hierarchical navigation. The second one is the flat navigation. Flat navigation is something that you use for applications that have tab bars, and we can actually go back in here and open up, for example, the health app, and you see this summary and there is browse. So there's summary and browse which are present, and the two different individual components that you can navigate to from any screen. Like I clicked on activity, I'm inside activity, but I can still go and hit the summary and navigate back to summary directly. So there are multiple tab options, starting points, and each one can have their own drill down navigation which is present. So that's flat navigation. Then there can be content driven navigation. Now this one is more complex, and you can start thinking about is that you have an app which has a login screen, and you basically have the customer enter the username, password, trying to do the authentication. But for certain customer, you figure out that the best mechanism to move forward is to provide a step up auth challenge. So you totally navigate for those customers into a different navigation pattern or for step up auth, which depends upon whether the drill down looks like you're supposed to OTP challenge, email challenge, or some other virtual challenge that needs to be presented. And once it is done, you're supposed to come back to the starting point where the navigation actually forked off into step up auth challenge. So it content based navigation is one such example of an experience that we can actually provide. We are going to start digging slightly deeper now into the theory behind the navigation paradigm. And then we're going to see a working example so that a lot of things are much more clearer in our head. So, starting again, first we want to look at this diagram primarily so that we can understand what constitutes the view that we see on the screen. So this is a screen that is presented by, and the last one, I'm actually pointing to the last one. If you can see, I can actually zoom in. So um, the last screen is the final screen the user sees, but that's a set of assembled views. Um, as we already know so far, is that this window, which is created by the iOS platform itself, which is just a placeholder where our app screen will actually come in. It's clear, there's no real content on it. Then on top of it, I can have a navigation view. I can have a tab bar. I can have a combination of this. I may have a tab bar, may not have a tab bar. I may have a navigation view, I may not have a navigation view. But these would come on top of the window. So as a result, this will decrease the safe area that is available for our view to be displayed. And inside it would be a custom view hierarchy, which will be present. Now that's for our single view apps. Now we want to add multiple screens. So the way it's going to look like is we are going to have, when we launch our app, a first view controller. And that's basically the one which is linked to the main storyboard that is going to be displayed. And at some point later in the time, I want to push in a second view controller. So if I was a settings app, I'm basically pushing up the general view controller on top of the first view controller. And later down the line, when I'm done by hitting the back button of this done button on the screen, I'm just going to release the current view controller, which basically means is that I'm gonna destroy the object memory which was used for that second view controller and just display the first view controller, which was behind the second view controller. And we can see the example to make sure that we understand the lifecycle methods and what kind of an impact this means to the lifecycle methods which are out there. Again, it is such example, but the way or the easiest way I think that to start thinking about the navigation mechanism on iOS is start thinking about a deck of cards. Imagine that you have a deck of cards, and all you're doing is that you're taking the piece at the top of the deck of the card and you're placing on the table. That is your root view controller. Now you're going to take a second view controller, which is going to be present, and let's, in this example, say journal. And I'm going to place a second card, which is journal, on top of my root view controller. So and then I'm going to take upon my airdrop view controller and put it on top of the general view controller. So I'm building a navigation stack. So once I hit the back button, there's always a reference to go back from the airdrop to the general view controller and so on. So there is a deck of cards which has been built, and when I pop out of it, I'm just throwing away one page from the deck of the card. Now, as I went through this example, what data structure do you think that resembles the most in this world? And if you guess stacks, then you're right, because stacks basically work in the similar mechanisms. And in a stack, you go forward and you push an element, and you can keep pushing one, two, three, and so on, multiple elements. And when you pop the topmost element which is present, the stack is thrown off. And yes, you can throw away the entire stack if you want to. So the hierarchical navigation which is present is very similar to the stack data structure for storing the list of the view controllers which have currently been displayed. So you are allowed to move back and forth between those. One more item that you want to basically start thinking of is that, um, and I let me go back here, is how is all this information stored by the operating system? So the way it works is that we talked about the UI navigation controller. And when you're talking about navigation, then you have to add another controller, which is a navigation controller, which handles basically the navigation between the different controllers that are present in your application. And in this example, I have done is that I defined four navigation controllers. There's a root view controller, settings view controller, general view controller, auto lock view controller. And all these view controllers are displayed in the blue section here. The top section, which is the navigation controller, does not really has any view components which are present in any of these four view controllers, but this actually allows for managing the view controllers which I have already built up in the stack to know that which one was the first, which one was the second, and provide us mechanisms to navigate between those navigational on those view controllers. And navigation controller also allows you to add certain custom buttons so that you can jump navigation to different element, different power portions of the app. The composition of the navigation controller, you can see is that it has an array which maintains the view controllers that are actually present in the navigation stack. It has a navigation bar, which is a UI navigation bar and is a delegate, so you can actually go forward and implement it, and you can add like bar button items on top of it. Toolbar, sometimes used, sometimes not used, but there's an optional toolbar which is available, which if you want to, you can go forward and use the same. Now, um, another important point which we touched so far, which we want to cover here, is that in our example, we said that in the blue area is where you can go forward and put your content view. And the top area is the navigation controller, which just is used for navigation purposes. And of course, for tab bar, it will probably be at the bottom, and it can be different tabs which are present. This is a UI navigation controller, which is not a tab bar controller, which just allows going back, forth, and you can have bar button items. In either case, you should start thinking about is what happens to the safe area of your view. The safe area is actually reduced because anything which is behind the navigation controller or the tab bar controller will not be actionable by the user. So you have to think about your constraints when you have a navigation controller, because the safe area is actually going to shrink. Okay, with this said and done, let's go forward and look at a working example so that it's actually more clear. Now we're going to start with creating a simple example, and all we're going to do is that we're going to have two view controllers, first view controller, second view controller, and we want to provide a mechanism by which we can actually go forward and push the second view controller on top of the first view controller. Remember, there are three steps of adding a new screen in your iOS application. By default, till now, we have just worked with single page apps. Now, if when we want to move away from single page app to multiple page apps, we need to add new scenes. And the way you do it is that step one, you go forward and create a scene. And it's pretty straightforward, as you'll see. We'll go to the library, and in the library, we'll choose a view controller and simply add it to our storyboard. Second is we need to actually have a controller class where we're going to have our implementation logic. So we're going to go forward and create a new CocoTouch class. And then as the last step, which is step three, we need to link that particular scene to the controller. And we are going to do all these steps now. I'm going to go forward and create a new Xcode application. And I'm going to call it sample navigation. Let's just create it on the desktop for now. Okay, all sample application has been created for me. Now, before I move forward, since I'm going to be creating more files, I'm just going to divide them into new groups. And I'm going to have my views in one group. And I'm going to have my controllers in a separate group. I can have my models in separate group as well, but I'm really not going to have any models right now, so I don't need to worry about them. So my views get my two storyboards, and my controllers get my view controller, which is already present. So step number one was to go forward and if I'm adding the second controller, to go forward and add a new controller inside the app. So let's go forward and see what needs to happen. So you click on the library, you come in here, you just search for view controller, you find your view controller, and you basically drag and drop it. And I am going to position the view controller slightly away. This is my second view controller, so it's there. Now, step number two was to actually have a new controller class. So I am going to go forward and click on the file menu and choose to go forward and create a new file, and it's going to be a CocoTouch class that I'm going to create, and I'm going to name it second view controller. do a next. And the controllers is the right place for the file to be created. I get my second view controller, which is a child of UI view controller, all good. Now the only thing which is left is that if I go back to my main storyboard, click on my second view controller, go to the view controller, and check at the top, then in identity inspector, it's of type UI view controller by default, and I need to connect it to say that my controller is my second view controller. And I am done with all the navigational pieces of adding my second view controller. But really, there's no way to navigate to my second view controller right now because my photo playlist basically says that my main storyboard is main. So my main storyboard will get called and it will have the initial launch view controller. And the initial launch view controller currently is set to the first view controller, which is my initial view controller. And the way you know that it is the initial view controller is because there's an arrow which is pointing next to it, which is saying that okay, it's the storyboard entry point. But how do I go to the second view controller? Now, before we even go up till that point in time, let's just start labeling our view controller. So at least we know if at this point in time, even if I provide a mechanism to navigate to second view controller, you would not even notice that second view controller has been displayed. So let's go forward and simply add a label. I'm going to add a label here. I'm going to call it first view controller. And I am going to go forward and add a button, and I am going to call it go to second. Now I'm going to add some constraints here simply because they would make sense so that I can actually see it differently on different screens. Don't really need to do that for this particular example, but then if I run a different view, it just seems off and you might think that it's going wrong. Now I definitely want to specify the height. I'm going to add these three constraints, and then from alignment perspective, I'm going to vertically align this view controller. I'm going to select this label, and then I'm going to choose to horizontally center the text. For my second view controller, I want my second view controller to have a constraint relative to my first view controller. So I'm going to do vertical spacing constraint here. It's going to show a bunch of errors because it's vertically spaced, but I still need to tell where is the X and Y position for this view controller. So I can go forward to the constraints. I can define a couple of constraints here. I probably can occupy 50-50 on both sides. I can define the height. I can add these three constraints, but now it's basically complaining is that okay, where do you want it relative to the top one, and that's where I want to keep it. Now, this being done, I can actually go forward and center align the text for the second view controller as well. I can go forward and stop worrying about this set of constraints, and this is done. Now I need to add a second label to my second view controller. Second view controller, I'm going to do the same exercise with this one. I am going to define the constraints for this. I'm going to say that you are going to have some spacing which are leading and trailing, and then you have some height which is actually defined, and I would want you to be vertically aligned in the screen. That's said and done. I have got two view controllers which are defined now. Now I click on this guy and I can, just like I was defining constraints, I can just press the control key and drag and drop onto the second view controller. As soon as I do, this time I'm getting action segues, and the action segues are basically indicating what kind of relationship these two view controllers have. So when I click on the button, I'm going to move on the navigation to the second view controller. But how do I want to do that? Should I want to do show? Do I want to do show detail, present model, present as pop over, custom or custom? The push and model are basically deprecated, so I would recommend using them. Now, a bunch of them would not cause that much of a difference on iPhone. They're primarily going to have some difference like present is popover only on iPad. So we're not going to cover those here. But I'm going to start my journey with just going to go forward and say show. And what show does is that goes forwards and pushes the second view controller on top of the first view controller, but does not occupies the full screen as such. So now let's go forward and run this view controller. Okay, let's go forward. Execute. Sorry, just want to make sure that I'm executing it correctly. Also, I want to execute it for iPhone 12, not really on an iPod Touch. So let's go and play it on an iPhone 12 and see what happens. It's loading up the screen. It's a launch storyboard. Now it will transition onto the main storyboard. And there we go. I have my first view controller with go to second button. I can click on the second button and I can get the second controller directly. And this way, now you can have multiple screens in your app, and then you can provide navigation. Of course, second view controller could have had the button to go to third view controller, and then third could have the button for the fourth view controller, and so on. And that would have continued. Now, if the user needs to navigate back, since it was just show, which is push, I can just pull it down and I can go back to the first view controller, and then that's how the navigation actually occurs. Remember when we talked about all the navigation stack that is built up, we talked about the navigation stack being just like deck of cards. So you had the first view controller on the screen. When I clicked on go to second, I'm basically saying show. So I have my first view controller, but I'm putting on top of it the second view controller. And that's what is happening here. The second view controller is sitting on top of the first view controller, and as soon as I pull it down, the first view controller is actually displayed again. Now, there's some fun and interesting facts about it, which we should inspect. Number one is that let's put a breakpoint in view did load. So let's go forward and now add view will appear. So we're gonna override view will appear. Just going to have super call here, nothing much to do, but we want to add a breakpoint so that we can see when this function gets called. The same exercise we are going to do inside of my second view controller. I'm just going to have another function available here that we call view will appear. And the reason I'm putting these breakpoints is to show the life cycle of these controllers as we present different screens or scenes on the screen, and I move back and forth between them. Again, going back to the example of deck of cards, you had your first view controller. On top of the first view controller, you managed to put the second view controller. And then when you went forward and removed the second view controller, you have actually removed the object from the navigation stack altogether. And as a result, the second view controller object will be totally removed and will stop to exist. But once you close it and you're going to show the first view controller was always there. The object was already there. It was just behind the second view controller. So as a result, you will see that the view did load will not get called the second time, and only view will will get called because the object or the controller was already there. Let's go and check. The first time I go to second, the view did load gets called, the view will appear will get called, and I can see the second view controller. Then I go back and close it. Now, as I closed it, then the object or the view will it was itself already there. So as a result, you do not see the the view did load getting called again. But when I go back to the second view controller, the object was totally removed from the navigation stack. So as a result, you can clearly see the view did load got called again, and view will appear will get called again. I close this, nothing really happens. And that's how the objects are maintained in the memory. One quick note again, I'm gonna shut off these breakpoints so they're not creating too much noise. But so far, what we have done is that we have built multiple screens and we have built some sort of a navigation mechanism as provided by operating system by default, which is whenever I push a second view controller on top of an existing view controller, then it does not occupy the full screen. I can just pull it down and show it. But in certain cases, what's going to occur is you probably want not to leave certain screen at the top. You want to actually occupy the full screen, which you can. But if you occupy the full screen, then how do you navigate back and forth? And let's take a look at that for 1 second. So instead of me having the users push down, I may want to show actually a UI navigation bar at the top. And if you recall, this is more or less the option that you see every time you go to the settings app on your iPhone. So if you go to settings app, you launch it, you click on a particular setting, you go back and forth, you are seeing this navigation bar at the top, which has a screen title and lets you navigate back and forth the different view controllers. And if I want to do so, what I can do is inside my view controller, I can actually go forward, go to my editor and choose embed in. And under embed in, I have an option for tab bar and navigation controller. I basically want a navigation controller. So I clicked upon it. I get my navigation controller. And as you can see, the navigation controller has become my first entry controller. And then it's actually going forward and showing the first view controller inside it. And that's basically the relationship seg. And then I have a relationship seg where I'm pushing on the second view controller. But now instead of just occupying some portion on the screen, it's occupying the full screen and it has the option to say go back to my previous view controller. The navigation view controller also shows the title screen at the top. And here again, you can start thinking about is that it has an impact to the area that is visible on the screen because some portion of the screen will be taken by this navigation controller here and that will be used to display the title and title can vary by different screens. But as long as you're using defining your constraints with relevant to safe area, you're covered because the safe area may be altered, but the safe area and your constraints are relative to the safe area. So it will not be that the navigation controller will actually go forward and overlay and hide certain portions of your screen. Now, let's go forward and do one more thing. In my view did load, I'm going to set titles for this screen. Self.title, because I'm using navigation controller, I can go forward and set it. I'm going to say first screen. And then I can go to the second one and I'm gonna say self.title equals second screen. Simple enough. I'm gonna go and hit the play button once more to see what effect it takes. And I can see I'm on the first screen. I have a title here for the first screen. I click on it. I see my second screen. I cannot just pull it down to go back, but I have a navigation bar at the top. And in the navigation bar at the top, I can go forward and see the back button, which actually shows me the title of my previous screen to which I will navigate back and click on it and I can navigate back.
Going back to our example of navigation controllers and how they resemble a deck of cards, assume this is your first view controller. And when you have your first view controller and you decide to push a second view controller, on top of the first view controller, essentially you're bringing the second view controller and there are multiple animation options on how you want to have the transition occur. But eventually you are moving your second view controller on top of your first view controller. And then you can have subsequent view controllers like your third view controller come on top of your second view controller. And it's a deck of cards that is being built and it's going to stay. Eventually you're going to be done, like in your settings app you would when going from general to maybe privacy to notifications. Eventually you're done with using the view controller and you're going to use the navigation controller to hit the back button, and essentially you're removing the top view controller from the stack. you still had the two view controllers present inside the stack. And as a result, you will not see the view did load get called. The view did appear will get called again because now something that is blocking them has been removed and these view controllers are now visible. Now, at this point in time, if I'm going to dump the second view controller, go back, then my first view controller gets displayed. And same thing, view did load doesn't get called, view did appear will get called. And if now I push back my second view controller, the view did load of the second view controller will get called again because it is no longer in the navigation stack, a fresh object needed to be created. But when I move the second view controller out, the first view controller was already there. So as a result, a fresh object needn't be created again.